Sarah Smith has been looking at the numbers precisely on trade. Just how reliant is our economy on the rest of Europe?
Trade is usually given as the key reason why we dare not leave the European Union. So let's take a look at those numbers. In 2011, we sold £234 billion worth of goods and services into the EU. We sold £259 billion worth to the rest of the world. So the EU does make up nearly half of our exports. But that pattern is shifting. Over the last 10 years, export growth to the EU has been 50%. It's been double that to the rest of the world as markets in China, India and Russia are all growing in importance. So what would happen to our trade links if we were to leave the Union? Well, in theory, then all of our exports would be subject to the common external tariff that's imposed on all imports into the EU. In practice, though, we could probably get around that. Switzerland, for example, has struck a free trade agreement with the EU, as have many other countries around the world. Last year, Switzerland sold £73 billion worth of exports into Europe, so they're obviously doing all right out of this deal. But they have had to accept quite a lot of EU rules as part of the bargain.
Well, joining the discussion with Roland Rudd and Mark Reckless MP, we have Rajesh Agrawal he's the CEO of Rational FX, which is a foreign exchange company, the pro-European economist Katinka Barish, she's Deputy Director of the Centre for European Reform, and Pierre-Yves Gerbeau, who is a French entrepreneur based in the UK. And PY, I want to start with you because you are in a big business, leisure business, very Europe-wide. And yet you're a bit of a skeptic.
Well, I think I'm a skeptic for the Eurozone, and I think the skepticism is I think the Franco-German model of federal state of Europe has failed. Now, do we need to exit? I say we, I'm a Brit these days, am I? But I think the UK PLC cannot afford to leave Europe, but cannot afford to stay and moan on the sidelines. I think there needs to be a leadership to be taken and to say, we don't want harmonization in employment, in defense. We want to go back to an economic union, which is good for business and for trade, but not the Franco-federal state.
Well, Katinka, I mean, you're an economist, you're objective, but you're also very pro-European, you're German, you're right in the heart of it all. What would you say to anybody who says, oh, come on, Britain can trade perfectly well with the rest of the world, it doesn't need the European Union?
Absolutely, Britain can trade perfectly well with the rest of the world, whether they're inside or outside. But they're in a much better position doing it from the inside, because what happens is that the emerging countries are not natural free traders. If the juggernaut of the European Union, that biggest single market in the world, comes along and says to the Chinese or the Indians, do open up your markets because then you can trade with us, they do so. If Britain comes along as an independent country afterwards and say, oh, by the way, can we have a free trade agreement too? I think it's going to be a lot more difficult.
That's going to be your problem, Mark Reckless, isn't it?
Well, we remain one of the larger economies in the world. We have a very significant domestic market.
But you'd want to go on trading with Europe, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I certainly would, but in order to trade with someone, you don't have to be governed by them. Germany will want to carry on selling BMWs and Mercedes to us. The idea that if we were to leave the EU, there'd suddenly be tariff barriers or millions of jobs would be at risk is just ludicrous.
But would BMW stay here if we weren't in Europe?
It may well not, because if you think of the car industry, it employs 700,000 people. Half the cars are exported to the EU. We come out of the EU, we probably have import taxes of around 10 to 20%. It's a very good chance that half of those jobs will be lost, and some of those companies will actually relocate to other parts of the European Union where they wouldn't pay the tax. Why would they pay the tax in Britain?
Rajesh, you deal with money and you deal with currencies and people changing money here, there and everywhere, and you've got fast methods of doing it. What difference does Britain being in Europe make to you?
I think it's going to make a phenomenal impact, and it will adversely affect businesses in general in the UK, and specifically the financial services industry.
I'm going to have to hold you for a moment because your mic's just off, but I'll get that sorted in just a moment. Let me just come back to you then, Mark, because at the end of the day, you have a situation in which globalization is moving apace, and you want us to get into a smaller unit. UK PLC?
No, on the contrary, I want us to trade with all the markets in the world, to have free trade with all countries, not to have this common external tariff. Why should a woman have to pay 8 or 9% tax to the EU every time she buys a bra from China? We don't produce that sort of stuff, but they have these tariffs to protect inefficient manufacturers in Portugal and Italy, and when they negotiate these free trade deals, they don't have the priority of trying to get access for business and financial services that is the key for Britain, and we should force, if we're actually negotiating on our own as an independent country.
Services. Financial services is your business. What difference would it make if Britain pulled out?
I mean, we talk about single market, but also we have to talk about the regulations. There's a thing under the EU arrangement called passporting. So, for instance, if you're in financial services business and you're licensed in the UK, you can then passport your license to across 27 countries in the EU. Now, if the UK leaves the EU, then a lot of these financial services companies will have to obtain their new license, which can be quite a rigorous process.
Well, now, Roland, quite realistically, the future in the world is in the BRIC economies. Our children should be learning Mandarin, not French.
Well, sure, but I mean, there's no reason why we turn our back on 47% of our trade in the European Union. And remember, the government's own figures say the single market's probably worth up to 600 billion a year for us in trade. That's an extraordinary amount of money and jobs and business. And to actually put that in jeopardy because of some ideology would be real madness.
But PY, your business, leisure, it's out there, Far East, Brazil.
Yeah, the growth is there, but you know, as Roland says, there's a huge business in Europe. I mean, you look at tourism; it comes more for Europe than from Far East and from the US. So leisure as a whole, and I'm not saying, you know, stay in Europe just as a passive. Take the leadership, change the model, and this is what UK needs to do. Tony Blair started to do that. It needs to be followed by Mr. Cameron.
Well, more voices, more debate.
Britain if we weren't part of the EU.
More voices, more debate later in the programme. But for now, let's go back to Krishnan in the studio for the rest of today's news.
Thanks, John.